Hey everybody, this is Tracy here with another edition of A View from Tracy's Point, and we are here to follow up on Judge Donnelly's two questions that she had for the defense attorney Jennifer Bonjean and the prosecution in the Eastern District of New York regarding Jennifer Bonjean's challenge to the Rule 29, which involved her questions. Well, Jennifer Bonjean was trying to raise a Rule 29 motion regarding the charges against Mr. Kelly in California and New York that involved the transmission of herpes. And so Judge Donnelly had some questions, and I'll post the link above, and you can go back and look at that video where it explains what her questions were. So Jennifer Bonjean is responding, and so she says, "Dear Judge Donnelly, defendant submits his letter in connection with the court's order dated May 19, 2022, seeking additional briefing concerning defendant's Rule 29 challenges to Section 120290 of the California Health and Safety Code and Section 2307 of the New York Public Health Law. A. Defendant made a proper Rule 29 challenge to the government's proof that defendant violated Section 120290 of the California Health and Safety Code. Defendant also shows good cause for failing to challenge the applicability and constitutionality, y'all know me when I get tie-tongued, of the 2015 version of Section 12290, where the government failed to give prior notice of its intent to charge the jury pursuant to the modified repeal statute." And I think somebody brought up in the comments on the last video that they remembered there was something in the jury charge and they wanted to know if that would count. And so Jennifer, I didn't think it would count because they were looking for motions at the beginning of the trial to dismiss the charges. But Jennifer is bringing it up here. She says that they said the government failed to give prior notice of its intent to charge the jury pursuant to the modified repealed statute. So she goes on to say the government charged defendant with 2 Mann Act violations, alleging inter alia that defendant transported Jane to California with the intent of exposing her to herpes in violation of California Health and Safety Code Section 120290, Racketeering Acts 8 and 9. In his Rule 29 motion, defendant challenged the government's proofs on those counts in several ways, including arguing that the government did not prove every element of Section 12290 beyond a reasonable doubt. The sufficiency of the evidence question is muddied by the fact that the jury was charged with a modified version of an inoperable 2015 version of the statute. The parties disagree whether the court was permitted to charge the jury pursuant to the government's instruction. The specific question of whether the jury was properly charged may not constitute a proper Rule 29 issue, but it is preserved for appellate review since trial counsel objected to the court's jury charge, arguing that it did not reflect the operable statute of the law. Docket 219, government's response found at docket number 220. Okay, so I was right that it didn't apply because it was following the trial, and what they're looking at here is motions that were filed, I guess, prior and during the trial. Okay, but she's putting it in the record just for when she goes to the Seventh Circuit, the Second Circuit. I'm sorry, because we know Judge Donnelly about to cut up. Anyway, so she goes on to say separately, defendant pointed out in his Rule 29 memo that the 2015 version of the statute is unconstitutional and that neither the government nor this court possess the authority to rewrite the statute to save it from a constitutional challenge. Defendant concedes that a constitutional challenge to a statute is not equivalent to a sufficiency of the evidence challenge. Defendant also concedes that trial counsel did not specifically challenge the constitutionality of California Health and Safety Code section 120290, but that is because the government did not apprise the defense of its intent to have the jury charged pursuant to a repealed version of the statute that is also rewrote. Defendant shows good cause for failing to challenge the statute in a pretrial motion, as it did the New York Public Health Code provision, United States versus O'Brien, which was heard in the Second Circuit 2019. Even if this court were to conclude that trial counsel failed to timely raise a constitutional attack to California Health and Safety Code section 120290, trial counsel was ineffective for failing to do so. Strickland versus Washington. And that was a case from 1984. Okay, so when I read the motion by Thomas Farinella, I think we all agreed that he only really talked about the New York case. He didn't talk about the California part of it. So she's conceding that. But she's saying that then it goes to the ineffective counsel portion of her arguments, that they didn't do a good job in raising these motions and calling out these inadequacies. So all that aside, defendant also raises a sufficiency of the evidence question by arguing that even if the elements of the statute were properly charged, the government did not prove that defendant was contagious, infected, or had the capacity to transmit herpes during the sexual encounter he had with Jane in May 2005. Defendant motion MOL at 33. MOL. Okay, I can't remember what that stands for. Defendant also argued that the government's proof was lacking insofar as it failed to show that defendant acted willfully with knowledge of the consequences. The wrinkle here is that this court cannot answer this Rule 29 question without first deciding whether the jury was properly instructed pursuant to the applicable law. Defendant cannot be said to have waived his challenge to the jury charge, where he expressly objected to the instruction charged and offered the operable version of the section 12290. Because the government failed to put defendant on notice that it was charging defendant with a rewritten version of the 2015 statute until trial was nearing its end, defendant shows good cause for failing to move to dismiss the counts pre-trial or challenge the statute's constitutionality. Alternatively, trial counsel was ineffective as described supra. Notwithstanding all the above, this court must decide whether the jury was properly instructed pursuant to the applicable law to determine whether defendant's sufficiency of the evidence challenge should be sustained. All right, Jennifer, you just backing them up in a corner, right? Like you can either do this or that, but if you do that, then that means this, and then we're going to come over here, and then we're going to change it around and move it over here. And either way, you flip it, switch it, turn it around, y'all still wrong. That's basically what she's saying. So B, defendant's Rule 29 challenge as to New York public health law. Defendant concedes that his challenge to the New York public health law Section 2308 are constitutional in nature. Defendants' constitutional challenges to Section 2308 are preserved for appellate review. 1. The government, and this is a note at the bottom of the page, the government cited to the statute in the indictment referencing the statute with an effective date of 1998. The mere sight could not have put counsel on notice that the government intended to charge an inoperable version of the statute or that it intended to modify the elements. But if this or any other court finds that the indictment did put defendant on notice, trial counsel was ineffective for failing to challenge the indictment and the constitutionality of the intended modified statute pre-trial. No possible trial strategy exists for this omission where trial counsel clearly understood its importance when it challenged the New York public health law on similar grounds. Sincerely, Jennifer Bonjean. All right, I don't know. How strong do y'all think that response was? It's sort of like she's admitting, like, yeah, we might not have did what we were supposed to do, but we're going to argue it anyway. And then she's trying to backdoor her way into it. That's kind of how I'm reading this. Maybe you all read it a different way. So she's acknowledging that there were some errors, and if Ann Dunley doesn't want to view those errors, then she wants to move it over to her motion where, for ineffective counsel. Okay, so then in the response that came from the Eastern District of New York to the questions by the judge, this is their response. It says, "Dear Judge Donnelly, the government respectfully submits this letter pursuant to the court's May 19, 2022 electronic order directing the parties to address two questions. With respect to the court's first question, whether Rule 29 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, Rule 29, is the proper vehicle to challenge Section 120290 of the California Health and Safety Code and Section 2307 of the New York Public Health Law, the government respectfully submits that it is not. By its plain language, Rule 29 allows the court to grant a judgment of acquittal only when there is insufficient evidence to sustain a conviction. Federal Rules of Criminal Procedures 29, United States versus Al-Ghazi, which was a case heard in the Southern District of New York in June 9, 2009. And then they have a quote, Rule 20, for another case, Rule 29 only authorizes motions challenging the sufficiency of the evidence presented at trial. Citations omitted. And that was from United States versus Height, which was heard in the District of D.C. in 2013. And then in another case, they have, although styled as a Rule 29 motion, the defendant in essence moves to dismiss the superseding indictment for failure to state a claim. Rather, the vehicle through which the defendant could have properly raised those challenges is Rule 12 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. Indeed, the defendant did raise certain challenges regarding the counts that reference Section 2307 through Rule 12, and the court denied those challenges. Those rulings remain the law of the case, and the defendant has offered no basis to disturb them. And then there's a note at the bottom of the previous page. It says, in Height, the district court rejected the government's argument that the defendant's Rule 29 motion, which was in fact a Rule 12 motion, was untimely because the version of Rule 12 in effect at the time allowed a defendant to move to dismiss an indictment for failure to state a claim at any time. Rule 12 was subsequently amended in 2014. As set forth below, the previous version of Rule 12 no longer applies, and Rule 12 now requires that motions to dismiss an indictment for failure to state an offense in the circumstances at issue here must be made pre-trial. See Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure 12B3BV. As a result, the district court ruling in Height regarding the timeliness of the defendant's Rule 12 motion is not applicable here. Okay, so they're citing case law, which states that any objection has to be during the pretrial state, and that since they did not clearly make this particular motion worded the way that Bonjean has it worded, Therefore, there's nothing they can do about it. They can't cry foul now because the pretrial motion, there was no pretrial motion to specifically address what she's talking about. So even though they broke the rules and they used outdated legislation, outdated statutes, that because they didn't bring it up, then it's no foul. Like, even though you didn't see the ball go out of bounds and the person caught it, it's still out. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's just so crazy that they just make up rules the way that they go, as they go. So anyway, continuing on, it says, with respect to the court's next question, whether the defendant's challenge to section 120-290 of the California Health and Safety Code is timely, the government respectfully submits that it is not. As set forth above, the proper vehicle through which the defendant could have raised this challenge in this regard is Rule 12, specifically Rule 12. So they're basically going over the same thing, saying that what I just read in that note. So then it goes on, significantly in 2014, Rule 12 was amended to remove language that allowed the court at any time while the case is pending to hear a claim that the indictment or information fails to state an offense. Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure 12, Committee Notes on Rules 2014 Amendment. As the committee notes explain, this specific charging error was previously considered fatal whenever raised and was excluded from the general requirement that charging deficiencies be raised prior to trial. The Supreme Court abandoned and jurisdictional justification for the exception in United States versus Cotton, which was a case from 2002, overruling Ex parte Bain in a case from 1887. Insofar as it held that a defective indictment deprives a court of jurisdiction. Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure 12, 2014 Amendment. Here, the defendant challenge is properly characterized as one of failure to state an offense and is not jurisdictional in nature. As a result, the defendant was required to file such a motion prior to trial. In essence, the defendant argues that Racketeering Act 8 fails to state an offense because the alleged activity was not activity for which a person can be charged with a criminal offense. Because the version of the California statute in effect in 2015 and referenced in the indictment has since been repealed, his claim is an analogous. I know I'm pressing that. analogous. Okay, 2-1 posited in Lamar versus United States, which was a case from 1916, where the defendant challenged his conviction for having falsely pretended to be an officer of the government of the United States, to wit, a member of the House of Representatives, specifically objecting that the indictment did not charge a crime against the United States. As the Second Circuit explained approvingly in United States versus Youssef from 2014, abrogated on other grounds by United States versus Van der Ende, which was heard in the Second Circuit in 2019. The defendant in Lamar argued that the court lacked jurisdiction to hear the case because a member of Congress is not an officer of the United States. But as Justice Holmes explained, nothing can be clearer than the district court, which has jurisdiction of all crimes cognizable under the authority of the United States, acts equally within its jurisdiction whether it decides a man to be guilty or innocent under the criminal law, and whether its decision is right or wrong. As the defendant's argument went, therefore, only to the merits of the case. They just going all around the monkey's behind. Then they go on to say, rejecting a post-trial challenge to an indictment charging attempted aggravated identity theft. They're talking about something totally different. Where the statute did not allow charges based on attempt, because it was one for failing to state an offense, was not jurisdictional in nature and was therefore untimely. So they were citing a case from the Seventh Circuit in 2020. Accordingly, the defendant's challenge in this regard to Racketeering Act 8 is not jurisdictional, and any Rule 12 motion raising such a challenge is now untimely. The defendant has offered no cause, let alone good cause, for his untimeliness, and to the extent the court construes his Rule 29 motion as a Rule 12b3 motion, it should be denied on that basis. So they're basically saying that they know that they charged him incorrectly, that they charged him with statutes that were no longer on the book, and they were hoping that the defense didn't pay attention to that, and they didn't pay attention to it, and so therefore they won the game because they didn't notice that the ball that they hit was out of bounds, and we caught the ball, so now they're out. And there's nothing that they can do about it. And so they want the judge to agree with them that because they didn't raise it in the pre-trial, that it doesn't matter that it was a lie or it was unconstitutional or whatever, because the defense didn't raise it prior to trial, then they get away with using outdated statutes to convict this man. And then read the wrong instructions to the jury. So they charged them with statutes that were outdated, no longer in effect, and then read during the jury instruction the statute that was in effect at the time, and the jury found him guilty even though that's not what he was charged with. Hey, I guess that's how it goes, y'all. So anyway, go ahead, leave your comments below, rate the video, and subscribe to the channel. And until the next time, I shall talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.